I'm Daniel, and for a long time I believed quiet was the same as peace. My life had settled into a predictable rhythm, early mornings, long workdays, and evenings spent beside my husband, Mark, in a house that looked complete from the outside. We had been married for 6 years, long enough for passion to soften into routine. Nothing was broken in a way that could be pointed to, yet something essential had faded. Conversations became shorter, silences longer. We loved each other, but love had learned how to stand at a distance. Mark worked late most nights. When he came home, exhaustion wrapped around him like armor. I learned not to ask questions that might start arguments or reveal how lonely I felt even while sharing a bed. Instead, I told myself that this was adulthood, that stability required sacrifice. Still, there were moments, small, unguarded moments, when I wondered if I had quietly disappeared inside my own marriage. Our neighborhood was the kind where people waved politely but rarely lingered. That changed when Ethan moved in next door. He was friendly without being intrusive, the sort of person who remembered names and asked how your day had been. We discovered quickly that we shared small things, similar taste in music, a love for late-night walks, the experience of growing up feeling slightly out of place. Ethan was openly gay, comfortable in himself in a way I admired but didn't fully understand. At first, he was just a neighbor, someone to exchange casual words with over the fence. Weeks passed, and those brief conversations became familiar. Ethan had a way of listening that made silence feel intentional rather than awkward. Still, I kept a careful distance. I was married. Whatever emptiness I felt was not an invitation for anything else. One evening, after a particularly draining day, I came home to an empty house. Mark had texted to say he'd be late again. I tried to ignore the familiar disappointment settling in my chest. Instead, I decided to take a long bath, hoping the quiet would wash the day away. The bathroom filled with steam, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to breathe without pretending that I had just begun to relax when I heard footsteps in the hallway. At first, I assumed I'd imagined them. Then the door opened. Ethan stood there, frozen, his expression shifting instantly from concern to shock. He apologized quickly, stumbling over his words. He said he thought I'd called out earlier, that he'd been worried something was wrong. I told him, just as quickly, that he shouldn't be there. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. The moment lasted only seconds, but it felt far longer. Ethan stepped back, repeating his apology before closing the door behind him. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to understand what I was feeling. I knew one thing clearly: he had entered without my permission, and that line mattered, yet beneath the shock, something unsettled me even more. I wasn't only angry or frightened. I was confused, by the way my emotions tangled together instead of separating cleanly. That realization filled me with guilt before Mark's name even fully formed in my mind. That I ended the bath early and dressed, replaying the incident again and again. Ethan hadn't meant harm, but intention didn't erase impact. I told myself that this was the end of it, that neighbors made mistakes and boundaries existed for a reason. Still, my thoughts betrayed me. I wondered why the intrusion had shaken me so deeply, why it had awakened feelings I had tried hard not to acknowledge. When Mark finally came home, I almost told him. The words sat at the back of my throat, heavy and urgent. But he looked tired, distant in the way I had grown used to, and I swallowed the truth instead. We exchanged routine questions, routine answers, and went to bed without touching. Lying awake beside him, I understood that something had shifted. Not because of Ethan alone, but because the incident had exposed a crack I could no longer ignore. The quiet I had mistaken for peace was no longer comforting. It was demanding to be confronted. As sleep finally came, one thought refused to leave me: a boundary had been crossed that evening, and whether I wanted it or not, my life was already moving toward consequences I didn't yet understand. The days following the incident were defined by avoidance. I timed my comings and goings to reduce the chance of running into Ethan, convincing myself that distance would restore balance. Yet the more I tried to dismiss what had happened, the more it lingered. It wasn't the intrusion alone that unsettled me, it was the way it had forced me to acknowledge how exposed I already felt in my own life. eventually, avoidance proved impractical. One afternoon, as I was checking the mail, Ethan approached me cautiously. He looked nervous, nothing like the confident neighbor I thought I knew. He apologized again, slower this time, choosing his words with care. He said he understood if I wanted space and that he had no excuse for crossing a boundary. I listened, arms folded, weighing my response. His sincerity disarmed me. I told him I appreciated the apology, but I made it clear that what happened couldn't be repeated. He agreed without hesitation. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the beginning of something more complicated. Our conversations resumed, but with a new gravity. We spoke less about music or the weather and more about exhaustion, about the quiet disappointments that accumulate when expectations go unmet. Ethan talked about past relationships that had taught him how easily affection could turn into dependency. I found myself admitting things I hadn't said out loud before, how lonely I sometimes felt even while married, how I missed being truly seen. At home, Mark remained largely unaware. His schedule hadn't changed, and neither had his habits. When he was present, he was kind but distracted, as if his attention were always needed elsewhere. I told myself that confiding in Ethan was harmless, that friendship required honesty. Still, I noticed how I began to anticipate our conversations, how his messages made me feel lighter in a way that scared me. The line between companionship and intimacy blurred gradually. There was no dramatic moment when I decided to cross it. Instead, it happened through small choices, replying too quickly, sharing too much, withholding too often from the person I had promised honesty. I stopped mentioning Ethan's name at home. I told myself it was to avoid unnecessary tension, but the truth was simpler. I was hiding something. Ethan noticed the change before I did. One evening, he asked me directly if talking to him felt wrong. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, then admitted that I didn't know anymore. He didn't press. Instead, he said something that stayed with me, that emotional closeness carried its own responsibilities, even without physical acts to define it. His restraint made the weight of my choices heavier, not lighter. Despite that awareness, I didn't pull away. If anything, the honesty drew me closer. There was comfort in being understood without explanation. With Ethan, I didn't have to soften my disappointments or pretend I was content. That comfort became addictive. I began to compare it, unfairly, to the quiet distance I shared with Mark. One night, after another late text from Mark canceling dinner plans, I found myself sitting across from Ethan on his porch. We spoke openly, acknowledging the tension neither of us could ignore. There was no denial, no excuses. We named what we were feeling and agreed, carefully, that nothing would happen without clarity or consent. Even so, the admission itself felt like a betrayal. I knew then that infidelity had already taken root, not in action but in intention. The guilt arrived soon after, sharp and persistent. I looked at Mark differently, aware of the secret shaping my interactions with him. Every ordinary gesture, his tired smile, his absent-minded questions, felt loaded with meaning. I wanted to be honest, yet I feared what honesty would dismantle. Ethan sensed my conflict and, to his credit, urged caution. He reminded me that unresolved needs didn't justify deception. His words were measured, not possessive, and that made them harder to dismiss. I realized that whatever path I chose would demand accountability. As the night ended and I returned home, I understood that neutrality was no longer an option. I was standing between comfort and integrity, between the life I had built and the truth I was avoiding. The choice ahead frightened me, not because I didn't know what was right, but because I wasn't sure I was ready to face the cost of doing it. The tension I carried followed me everywhere. At work, I reread emails without absorbing their meaning. At home, I watched Mark move through familiar routines as if he were slowly drifting farther away, not because he chose to, but because I had already begun stepping back. The secret I held altered the air between us. Even silence felt dishonest now, Mark noticed before I found the courage to speak. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, he asked why I seemed distant. His voice was calm, but his eyes searched my face with a quiet urgency. I opened my mouth to offer an excuse, then stopped. The words felt brittle and false. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to be fully present that I told him the truth, not all the details, but the essential ones. I explained how lonely I had been, how I had sought understanding outside our marriage, and how that choice had crossed a line long before anything physical could. I didn't blame him. I didn't defend myself. I spoke plainly, knowing that clarity was the least I owed him. Mark listened without interrupting. When I finished, the room felt unbearably still. He said he appreciated my honesty, though the pain in his voice was unmistakable. He admitted that he had grown complacent, assuming stability meant safety. Yet hearing that I had turned elsewhere forced him to confront how fragile we had become. Trust, he reminded me, erodes quietly but collapses all at once. That night, we talked longer than we had in years. There were no raised voices, only difficult admissions. Mark asked whether I was in love with Ethan. The question cut deeper than I expected. I answered honestly, I didn't know, but I knew I had allowed something unresolved to become something dangerous. He nodded, absorbing the answer without relief. The following days were marked by careful distance. We agreed to give each other space to think, not as punishment, but as necessity. Living under the same roof while navigating uncertainty was exhausting, yet it forced me to examine my own motives without distraction. I began to understand that what I had mistaken for connection was also escape. Ethan reached out once more, sensing the shift. I told him about my conversation with Mark and what it had cost. He listened, then said something that surprised me, that stepping away was the most respectful choice we could make. He acknowledged his role without defensiveness, recognizing that concern could still cause harm when boundaries blur. His willingness to retreat stripped away any illusion that this was a story driven by romance alone, that we parted without promises. There was sadness in that ending, but also relief. For the first time since the incident, I felt aligned with my values, even if the outcome remained uncertain. Choosing accountability over comfort did not erase the damage, but it stopped it from spreading further. In the weeks that followed, Mark and I faced each other with a new honesty. We didn't rush toward resolution. Instead, we examined the fractures that had existed long before Ethan entered our lives. Some days were hopeful, others unbearably quiet. Yet even uncertainty felt cleaner than deception. That I came to understand that infidelity rarely begins with a single act. It grows in the spaces where needs go unspoken and boundaries go unguarded. What happened forced me to confront parts of myself I had avoided, my fear of conflict, my hunger for validation, my reluctance to demand presence from the person I loved. The story does not end with certainty. Whether Mark and I will rebuild or part ways remains unresolved. What I know is this: crossing a boundary, whether intentional or accidental, demands reflection, not denial. The moment I stopped pretending that silence was harmless, I began to reclaim agency over my life. As I move forward, I carry that lesson with me. Desire without responsibility leads to loss, but honesty, even when painful, offers the possibility of something truer. And sometimes, facing the consequences of your choices is the only way to finally be seen, both by others and by yourself. The weeks after my confession unfolded slowly, measured not by days but by conversations that demanded patience. Mark and I began attending counseling, not as a declaration that we would stay together, but as an agreement to understand what had gone wrong. Sitting across from him in that neutral room, I realized how long we had been speaking around each other instead of to each other. The distance between us had not appeared overnight, it had grown quietly, nourished by avoidance and fatigue. Mark surprised me with his willingness to look inward. He spoke about the pressure he felt to provide stability, how that responsibility had narrowed his focus until emotional presence felt like an optional luxury. Hearing him articulate that truth softened something in me. It didn't erase the hurt, but it reframed it. We were not enemies in this story, we were two people who had failed to protect something fragile. At home, our interactions changed. We became deliberate, choosing words carefully, listening longer than felt comfortable. Some nights ended in shared laughter, tentative and unfamiliar. Others ended in silence that felt heavier because it was intentional. Through it all, I resisted the urge to escape discomfort by seeking reassurance elsewhere. I understood now how easily that impulse had led me astray. Ethan remained absent, by mutual understanding. Occasionally, I thought of him, not with longing, but with clarity. What I had felt was real, yet it belonged to a moment shaped by unmet needs rather than lasting intention. Acknowledging that truth allowed me to release the fantasy that had once tempted me. There was no resentment in letting go, only acceptance. One evening, Mark and I took a walk through the neighborhood. It was an ordinary act, yet it felt symbolic. As we passed familiar houses, including Ethan's, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The past lingered, but it no longer dictated the present. When Mark reached for my hand, the gesture felt earned rather than assumed. Still, uncertainty remained. Counseling revealed wounds that would take time to heal, and some questions had no immediate answers. Were we rebuilding, or simply learning how to part with honesty? The ambiguity frightened me less than it once would have. I had learned that clarity does not always arrive neatly. Sometimes it emerges through sustained effort. That I reflected often on the moment everything began to unravel, the intrusion that forced me to confront my own boundaries. It taught me that consent is not only about physical space, but emotional access as well. I had allowed someone into parts of myself that should have been guarded, not because I intended harm, but because I feared emptiness. Recognizing that fear became the foundation for change. As time passed, I felt a cautious sense of growth. I spoke more openly about my needs, even when doing so risked conflict. Mark responded in kind, meeting vulnerability with effort rather than retreat. Whether our marriage would endure was still uncertain, but whatever the outcome, it would be shaped by honesty rather than avoidance. The story I share is not one of simple redemption. It is about accountability, about understanding that love requires maintenance, and neglect creates openings where trust can falter. Infidelity, I learned, is rarely about desire alone. It is about what we choose to do with our dissatisfaction. Looking ahead, I no longer seek comfort in silence. I choose conversation, even when it is difficult. I choose boundaries that protect rather than isolate. And I accept that growth often begins where certainty ends. My life continues, unresolved yet grounded, shaped by lessons I did not expect but needed to learn.